Welcome to another episode of the MMA Lockcast. I'm your host, Manpreet, aka MMA Lock of the Night, your boy on social media at MMALOTN, and the architect behind the MMA Fight Archive, ensuring you leave no stone unturned when you're researching all these upcoming MMA events. With over 17 different promotions covered on this service and closing in on 4,500 fighter profiles for you to browse through, it is the largest library of its kind in the world for mixed martial arts. Again, 17 different promotions covered, from the Contender series to UFC, PFL, Bellator, ACA, KSW, and the list goes on. We add new fighters on a daily basis to ensure that we stay as up to date as possible with the MMA schedule, which is crazy. Every single week, there is always something to bet on, something to break down, and something to predict. There is a 7-day free trial for you to try it out. So before you dish out any dough, you're able to see whether this service is worth its bang for its buck or not. I think 95 subscribers will let you know that there is more than enough reason to sign to this service, especially if you like predicting and breaking down your own matchups. Direct links to past fights for all those fighters. Make sure you guys check out the MMA Fight Archive. Link in the description below. All right, this week we're going to be talking about UFC Vegas 98, headlined by a high-stakes flyweight matchup between former title challenger Brandon Royval and rising Japanese superstar Tatsuro Taira. A couple other fun fights sprinkled out throughout the card. Brad Tavares against Jun Young Park, the Iron Turtle, in the co-main event. The card kicks off with two very fun fights, in my opinion. I can't wait to break that down for you guys and see how those fights end up transpiring. But, you know, we got two back-to-back cards at the Apex after a big UFC 307. We have the Contender series coming to a close as well. I am recording this podcast a couple hours before Week 9 is about to kick off. Week 10 next week, the last week. We've been absolutely killing it on the Contender series, so I appreciate all the support and new love that I've been getting because of the Contender series. The least I ask of which, hit that subscribe if you haven't already, especially if you've been tailing your boy. And yeah, hopefully we can close out the Contender series on a strong note over the next 2 weeks. But first business will be trying to capitalize on this weekend's UFC card. Just a quick recap of last week's Lock of the Night and Dog of the Night plays. For the Lock of the Night, we cashed on Joaquin Buckley, who was actually, you know, the cards were split going into that third round, and the grappling wasn't as working out as effectively as I thought it was, but thankfully he still had that knockout power to put Stephen Wonderboy Thompson out in the third round with one of the most brutal knockouts that we've seen in terms of just jumping right into his power shot and eventually clipping Wonderboy Thompson and getting him out of there. So that cashes. Unfortunately, our ACA Lock of the Night loses by split decision. I thought it was a bad decision that should have gone the other way. So we go 1-1 on the weekend for Lock of the Night plays. That now brings our Lock of the Night record to 72-36 for a 67% hit rate. Again, just under 3 months left on the year. Hopefully we can get closer to that 70% by the end of it. Dog of the Night play. We were so damn close to cashing. I thought we should have got the decision to go our way, and we had Marina Rodriguez. Unfortunately for her, the judges, two of them, saw it on the opposite side for Yasmin Lucindo. Very unfortunate to not see the defensive grappling progression that you would expect from somebody as experienced as Rodriguez, knowing that's the kryptonite to her game. She looks completely lost off her back, and that ultimately led to her losing that matchup. We did win our ACA Dog of the Night play. I believe it was Herdison Batista, plus 105, solid cash there, but I think we cashed on a total of 4 underdogs on that card, considering there are 22 fights sprinkled out throughout that day. Very happy with my performance on that card, besides not hitting the Lock of the Night play. So that brings our Dog of the Night record now to 40-71 for a 36% hit rate. In terms of momentum, it is definitely on our side in terms of turning around the poor start to the year that we had for Dog of the Night plays. Hopefully we can end in the black or even green by the end of the year with the Dog of the Night plays. Quick plug for the MMALOTN Patreon page. That is the best way to show your boy support, where you can get written breakdowns on all these UFC cards upcoming, but also some of the regional events that I cover as well, including OKTAGON 62, which is going down Saturday afternoon as an appetizer to the UFC Vegas card. So if you want access to the written breakdowns for that, the Lock of the Night Patreon page is where to do it. That's where you also get early access to the free parlay that I drop later on in the week, so you guys are able to lock in better numbers than the public. A ton of other degenerate plays, parlays, fun stuff for you guys on there. That's where you will get the most information and content for your boy, the MMALOTN Patreon page. And then lastly, shout out to Godzillawins.com, providing your boy a platform to drop written content on a weekly basis for you guys. On Thursdays, we drop the main event breakdown, and then on Fridays, I give you guys my 3 best moneyline spots for every UFC card. That is GodzillawIns.com. Make sure you guys check them out as they cover all sports. So not just the MMA world, but they'll have you covered in all the other sports. NFL, obviously in full swing right now as well. Make sure you guys check it out, GodzillawIns.com. All right. We got 13 fights to talk about on this UFC Vegas 98 card. So without further ado, let's get right into this bad boy. First fight of the night goes down in the flyweight division. Funny that the card starts with flyweights and ends with flyweights as well. But in this first fight, we got hot prospects. Clayton Carpenter coming in at -205, going up against Lucas Rocha, who comes in at +175. Now, we'll start off on the Carpenter side, who has not seen any action since February of 2023. Luckily, he's only 28 years old, so he still has more than enough time to build himself up and potentially become a contender at some point, and I think he has all potential to do so. He has a very strong grappling game where he's shown off some slick jiu-jitsu and been able to submit a few opponents, but has shown constant improvements in his striking game, which will ultimately set up his takedowns and his grapple-heavy approach, which usually allows him to get his hand raised. He is 7-0 as a professional, training out of the MMA lab. He looks like he has all the goods and the cardio to fuel it through 15 minutes if need be, and I look forward to seeing him being a little bit more active now rather than, taking as much time as he has, especially between his last fight and this fight that he has coming up this weekend. Very hot prospect. Faced a little bit of adversity in his Contender Series matchup against Edgar Chairez, but was able to get his takedowns going and eventually control the Mexican fighter from that top position. End up getting the decision victory and getting signed to the UFC, where he is currently 1-0. His opponent this weekend is also coming off the Contender Series, where he picked up a big knockout by knee in his last fight against Davy Bittencourt. I'm talking about Lucas Rocha, who has a 17-1 professional record and has faced some pretty good strength of schedule on the Brazilian regional scene. But a lot of those fights, you do see him dealing with some issues, specifically in the grappling realm. Even in his second last fight coming into the UFC, or coming into the Contender Series, we saw him lose the first round strictly off of a grapple-heavy control from his opponent. He was able to get the back of Rocha and latch onto him. In the second round, Rocha did a slightly better job in terms of stopping the grappling, landing his offense with his high-pressure output and high volume, stamping a lot of his combinations with leg kicks. Third round, he did a great job in the first 3 minutes to land big enough damage, but the last 60 to 90 seconds of that matchup, he gave up his back once again and was unable to get out of that position, especially with his opponent being as gassed as he was. Luckily for Rocha, he was still able to get the decision that night. In his Contender Series fight, the first round, largely controlled by his opponent, who was able to get some dominant positions in the grappling realm. We did see some good resistance and pushback from Rocha in those positions, but for the majority of that round, it was clear that his opponent was winning it, and the scorecards reflected that. The second round, we knew, or Rocha at least knew, that his opponent was eventually going to dip for a takedown. But one thing that his opponent was doing a lot was also dipping his head, faking a takedown, but rather throwing an overhand to kind of just throw off the timing of Rocha. But Rocha timed it perfectly, landed a knee up the middle, and put his opponent clean out in one of the more brutal knockouts that we've seen on the Contender Series. Rocha is a solid prospect, but it's clear that he has an issue in his grappling game. He is active with looking for submissions, reversals, and get-ups, but once his opponent is able to get his back, he ultimately ends up having to fight off of his back the entire time, or with his opponent on his back the entire time. Does a good job in terms of stopping submission attempts from his opponents, but still finds it difficult to get out of those spots so that he can get back to his game. In this matchup specifically, I really think that the grapple-heavy approach from Carpenter is going to pay off for him quite a lot. Now, I know Rocha has nearly just over 2.5 times the experience that Carpenter has, but I do think Carpenter has a ton of potential and is more than capable of putting Rocha in those bad positions and keeping him there. I'm not entirely sure that Carpenter will be able to finish him, but I do think we'll see Carpenter consistently get to his wrestling, get to his grappling, and keep Rocha in those spots and just chip away at him, ultimately winning this fight on the scorecards. There's been a ton of action on Carpenter, as he was closer to -125, -130 130 a couple days ago. Now he's all the way up at minus 200, clearly showing that the public has a lot of love for him, and they should hopefully end up coming through even at that minus 200 line. So give me Carpenter and Carpenter by decision. Next up, we have another grapple heavy fighter and Dan Argueta coming in at plus 155, going up against Cody Haddon, who comes in at minus 185. Now we'll start on the Dan Argueta side, who started off 2023 very well with a dominant grappling victory over Nick Aguirre. He then followed that up with a which should have been a submission victory over Ronnie Lawrence, but unfortunately the referee stepped in a little bit too early, calling a stop to that fight, and then ultimately declaring it a no contest, robbing a victory for Dan Argueta, who seemed to be in control for as long as that fight was lasting, and then eventually getting that dominant submission attempt that he had. He then had to follow that up with another no contest against Miles Johns, although on the night of the fight, it was a loss as he was unable to get his grapple heavy attack going. Johns did a great job defensively and then ended up landing the better shots in the striking realm, ultimately winning that fight on the scorecards. But a couple months later, having the fight changed to a no contest due to a failed drug test. And then last time around for Dan Argueta, I believe the fight was in April, where he took on Gene Matsumoto, who he was defeating in the first round, utilizing his grapple heavy approach, staying on him, keeping that top position, had his position reversed a couple times, but ended up scrambling and getting back into top position. And all three judges scored that first round in his favor. It seemed like the second round was kind of going the same way, with Matsumoto still having some reversal opportunities, but unable to really get some success until the last 10 seconds of the round, where he was able to latch on to a guillotine and put Dan Argueta close to sleep, forcing Argueta to tap out and suffer another loss there. So the record only reads one loss, but it should technically be two losses now, and he's looking to ward off a third loss. I thought he was going to be a much better prospect coming into the UFC on short notice against a bigger opponent in Damon Jackson as an 8-0 prospect, but since fighting at bantamweight now, he's technically 1-2, but still, I think he has decent enough potential. I know he's 31 years old, but his pace, his pressure, and his wrestling is usually very hard to deal with for a lot of fighters that have yet to deal with that style. He's very good in terms of scrambling and continuously applying the pressure and then pushing his opponents against the cage and chaining wrestling attempts together to get them to the ground and eventually do good work in terms of keeping them there, landing damage, and looking for submission opportunities. It was impressive to see what he did against Myron Santos, who's obviously very successful now and made it to the UFC through the Ultimate Fighter. I think if they rematch, it probably would go a different way, but we still saw some great things from Argueta when he faced him in the LFA scene. Now, speaking about Cody Haddon, who just recently earned his UFC contract on week 2 of this season's Contender Series, he got called up quickly and was able to book a fight against a very tough opponent here in Argueta. Haddon, training out of Australia, has a 7-1 record, with his lone defeat coming 3 years ago at the hands of former title challenger Steve Erceg. Haddon shows some slick striking, good combinations, and good leg kicks, but we also saw a slick BJJ approach last time around, as he was able to get the back of his opponent Billy Brand, find the submission, and get the tap within 3 minutes. I think he is more so defined as a striker than a grappler, but it's impressive to see him lean on his grappling when he needs to get the victory that way as well. At 26 years old, I gotta say that I'm not the biggest fan of the strength of schedule he faced on the regional scene, but he did what he needed to do and still got his hand raised in those spots. But I wonder how he will deal with a guy in Argueta who's going to consistently be applying pressure, moving forward, and keeping him on uncomfortable spots. He could eventually utilize his BJJ to reverse those positions against Argueta, maybe wrap up a submission, but I think that we'll see Argueta really be knowing his back is probably against the wall here, probably going to get cut if he can't get the victory. He'll likely look to be as safe as possible in a lot of those spots. Apply that pressure, land some big shots to the head, get to his wrestling, chain it together, push him up against the cage, and keep him in those bad spots. I don't know if Haddon has faced anybody that will push him the way that Argueta will likely push him. It's one thing to face wrestlers on the Australian scene, but it's another to deal with a wrestler of the level of Argueta, especially at this level in the UFC. So we often get caught up in these Contender Series prospects coming into the UFC with a nasty knockout victory to earn that contract, and then overlook the veteran skills of the first opponent that the UFC normally puts them against. And I think that this is one of those spots where we'll see Argueta's experience. Again, he doesn't have a whole lot more fights. I think he only has 3 more fights on his record than Haddon, but the way that he's been fighting, the wrestling that he's able to apply, that could potentially be the difference maker here. I could be wrong, and Haddon's able to ward off those takedown attempts and then beat him to the punch because he is the better striker. But considering the number that we're getting here on Argueta, I think Argueta is worth a shot to try to pull off the upset here and put on a style that Haddon has just not faced or will be able to find any comfort in when he's going up against a guy like Argueta. So give me Argueta and Argueta by decision. Give me a shot on that underdog number. All right. Next up, heavyweight action as we have Chris Barnett coming in as a plus 300 underdog going up against Junior Tafa, who comes in at minus 400. Now, it's been a while since we've seen Chris Barnett. I believe it's been just over 2 years, as his last fight was in September of 2022, where he made a comeback victory over Jake Collier after getting hurt very badly in the first round. He was able to flip the script in the second round, get a dominant position in the grappling round, and eventually pound Collier out to a TKO halfway through that second round. Barnett, a 31-fight veteran, 38 years old as well. It's crazy to see how this guy's able to move considering the physique that he brings to the table. You're talking about a 5'9" guy that barely makes the 265-pound weight limit, but he can jump, he can fly, he can jump, he can spin. He does these crazy backflips inside the cage as well. Very athletic for the stature that you normally see from this guy. And that usually allows him to apply a lot of power when he's throwing his strikes, which has led to his victories over guys like Gian Vellante and Jake Collier. It's clear that, better strikers and better fighters will obviously get the better of him, just as we saw guys like Ben Rothwell and Martin Budai do. But he always has a puncher's chance. He's a little bit, he has some agility to his strikes when he throws them, but he does leave a lot of openings for people to equip him and hurt him and possibly put him away as well. But we can't overlook the experience advantage that he has coming into this matchup against the 8-fight veteran in Junior Tafa. Now, I don't really understand the hype on Tafa. I think his brother is way better than him, but Junior, 1-3 in the UFC right now. That one loss against Parker Porter got away with a blatant cheat where Porter was very close to completing a takedown, and we saw Tafa grab the fence. You can clearly see the tension on the fence with how heavy he grabbed it, and then from there he quickly found the knockout over Porter, who he clearly had a striking advantage over. Fight after that gets his leg chewed up by Marcos Rogerio de Lima in the opening minute, and then eventually got finished in the following round, and then Walter Walker was able to get him to the ground and get a heel hook submission win. And then again, I just don't understand the love on Tafa. Sure, he has a glory kickboxing background, but that doesn't mean that he's that great of a kickboxer. Like, he'll obviously have the technical striking advantage here over Barnett, but again, I wouldn't count out the possibility of Barnett landing that big shot of his own, or even looking for some grappling success and keeping Tafa on his back. There are a lot of holes in Tafa's game, in my opinion. I won't argue, though, he is the better technical striker here, but you can't completely trust him at minus 400. So my prediction is going to be Tafa by knockout. That has to be the pick. But in terms of betting this fight, I might look to actually bet the Barnett by KO prop, or even Barnett inside the distance. I doubt he has any submissions up his sleeve, but I do think that he can maybe look to get this fight to the ground and find a TKO from top position, or his speed might catch Tafa off guard and he lands a big shot that puts Tafa away as well. Huge age difference here, obviously, in favor of Tafa, but I cannot justify minus 400 on Tafa at all. Absolutely crazy there, in my opinion. So I'm going to go I'm going to go Tafa by KO as the official prediction, but Barnett is definitely worthy of a little bit of a sprinkle, especially on his KO prop, to upset Tafa and utilize that huge MMA experience edge that he has in this matchup. All right. Next up, welterweights going out of here as we have Themba Gorimbo coming in at minus 315, going up against Nico Price, who comes in at plus 265 for this welterweight matchup. First up, we got Gorimbo coming in on a 3-fight winning streak, most recently getting a grinding victory over Ramiz Brahimaj. Now, it was a very boring fight, let's be honest. He was pushing Brahimaj up against the cage, not often looking to take him to the ground. Brahimaj, we know he's dangerous, especially early with his jiu-jitsu, but he couldn't get anything going as Gorimbo seemed to be very strong and tough to deal with in those clinch positions. Gorimbo is a guy that normally goes out there and finishes his opponents very quickly with his wild striking, or he's able to utilize a grapple-heavy approach and keep his opponents in bad spots where he's just able to grind on them. Maybe not be the most effective with damage and staying active, but at least keeping them in bad spots where he's able to win the fight just off of having the control that he's able to maintain. He's 33 years old, has 17 fights under his belt, but I do not think he's as good as people are making him out to be. I don't understand this minus 315 line, especially against somebody as experienced and has a strength of schedule like Nico Price. Now, talking about Nico Bryce, he came off a very impressive performance against Alex Morono last time around, where we saw him, I believe it was winning the second and third rounds. The first round, it was a little bit of a slow start for him, but in the second and third rounds, we saw him use solid defensive grappling to get dominant positions on the mat, land some big shots from that top position, and then in third round, seemed to be the fresher fighter, utilize his footwork and his range striking approach to damage Morono and ultimately win that fight on the scorecards. Price can be chaotic at times, but it seems at this stage of his career, he's done a great job in terms of being a little bit more disciplined and a little bit more technical. It's obviously very hard to be super confident in him considering the knockout loss that he suffered at the hands of Phil Rowe and Robbie Lawler, but when he can stick to his game and when he can kind of nullify the approach of his opponents, is very difficult to deal with, even at 35 years old. So I was very surprised to see the line as wide as it is here. If Gorimbo is unable to get to his grapple-heavy approach, which we've seen Price do a good job in terms of shutting down from some opponents, and he's left to strike with a guy like Price, his wild striking approach could cause him some trouble against Price, who might be able to be a little bit better in terms of landing his shots straighter and down the pipe and countering Gorimbo. I also think Price has a better a cardio game here as well. So Gorimbo could slow down later on in this matchup, especially if he starts getting desperate with his takedown attempts and his grappling and his clinching. If Price is able to shut that down and keep Gorimbo working, look for Price to start running away with this matchup and possibly even getting a round 2 or round 3 finish. At plus 265, the veteran is definitely worth a shot here to upset Temba Gorimbo. And again, not completely understanding why the line is as wide as it is, but I still favor Price, and I think Price wins this inside the distance. All right, next up, featherweights going at it, as we have minus 150 on Jonathan Pearce going up against Pat Sabatini, who comes in at plus 130. Now, I'll start off on the Jonathan Pearce side of things, who's on a 2-fight winning or losing streak, I should say, but he definitely looked better in his second fight than he did in his first fight. Now, that first one was against Joanderson Brito, where he had solid success in the first round with his takedowns and his control. Second round, very desperate with his takedowns, which ultimately left his neck open for Brito to take, and he was able to get he ended up losing by submission that night. Then he followed that up with a fight against David Onamo, who's a very talented striker, very powerful striker, but also showcased a very improved defensive grappling game as he was able to cause a lot of scrambles and reversals that Pearce was somewhat able to keep up with, but once they got back to the striking realm, it was clear that Pearce was the one landing the more devastating blows, Onama was the one landing the more devastating blows, allowing Onama to get his hand raised once the fight hit the scorecards. But I was impressed with Pearce's cardio. It definitely looked better than it did in the Brito fight, and it seems like he's being a little bit more comfortable in terms of throwing in the striking realm, which will ultimately set up more ability for him to take fights to the ground when his opponents are starting to think that it's going to be more of a striking battle than a grappling battle. I do think he's still capable of achieving better things. He's 32 years old, firmly in his prime, and it's clear that he's learning from his mistakes, and I think that we're going to continue to see him grow and progress and become a better fighter. His opponent this weekend, Pat Sabatini, is looking to come off of or bounce back from a knockout loss at the hands of Diego Lopez last year in a fight where he tried getting the fight to the ground. We saw some good takedown defense from Diego Lopez, and that allowed Lopez to chip away at him and eventually find that finish on the feet. Sabatini is usually a very strong wrestler who has crushing top pressure to either control his opponents on the mat or find submission opportunities and get that as well. I believe he was the slight favorite or probably a pick'em line against Diego Lopez last year, which just goes to show how highly people rated Sabatini and how he probably, where he could potentially be had he defeated Diego Lopez that night, but maybe people were just overrating Sabatini at that point. I feel like I'm kind of overrating Diego Lopez a little bit, but again, not a bad loss for Sabatini to have on his record, especially considering what Lopez has been able to do since that matchup as well. Strong wrestler, strong top control, but I think he's going to struggle to establish that control here against Jonathan Pearce, who, in my opinion, better wrestler, may not be the better BJJ player, but he should do a good enough job in terms of keeping this fight upright if that's what he chooses to do, and then utilizing his pace and pressure to overwhelm Sabatini on the feet. I don't think Sabatini has much to offer in terms of the striking realm, hence you see him going for the grappling as often as he does. So I think that we're going to see Pearce look to utilize his wrestling defensively here so that he can keep Sabatini on the feet and then just overwhelm him and eventually break him and look for the finish as well. If this does end up on the mat as well, I am confident that Pearce can do a good enough job in terms of creating scrambles and reversals, or at least getting back to his feet. And I think that if he is successful in terms of setting the pace here, he should be able to outwork Sabatini and then possibly finish him in the second or third round by just, staying heavy with the pressure, keeping on the front foot, keeping Sabatini moving backwards, and just wearing him out, and then eventually finding that TKO finish. So I do like Pearce here at minus 150. I think the market's kind of low on him because of his last two performances, but I do think he is better than the price tag is indicating, which is why I think he ends up winning this fight. All right. Next up, flyweights going at it here as we have CJ Vergara coming in at plus 260, going up against UFC newcomer Ramazanbek Temirov coming in at minus 310. Now, we have to tip our hat to CJ Vergara, who has been taking any and all comers that the UFC is throwing at him. He was the underdog in 4 of his 6 UFC fights to this date. 3 of those 4 matchups, he was plus 220 or wider, and he was actually able to pull off the upset in one of those matchups against Clayton Rodriguez, which he won by split decision, but the other 2 opponents obviously able to defeat him. Now, Vergara is a guy that mainly utilizes his Muay Thai approach, utilizing good combinations and stamping most of those combinations with heavy leg kicks as well. He does lack a little bit of physicality, not a huge or a ton of power. He is hittable. He can be out-grappled, which is what opponents have been able to do, or at least the guys that have been able to beat him have been able to do, but he is definitely improving the defensive grappling side of his game. Seeing the spots that he was able to get out of against Asu Almabayev last time around really makes you think that this guy is clearly working on that aspect of his game, just so that he can keep fights in the striking realm where he usually has a fighting chance to get his hand raised. I just don't think he's going to be capable of crashing into that top 15 in the UFC flyweight division, especially if he continues to take these types of matchups against fighters that are on paper supposed to be better than him. His opponent this weekend, Temirov, is on a 9-fight winning streak, makes his UFC debut at 27 years old, finishing 7 of those 9 wins and a total of 12 finishes in his 17 professional victories. The last loss that he had, he was able to avenged just over 2 years after that loss had taken place, and it was against an opponent that looked to use a grapple-heavy approach to keep him on his back, but it's clear that he made improvements in that aspect of his game so he can keep fights in the striking realm where he is most effective and most dangerous. He's very explosive, utilizes a ton of footwork and lateral movement to eventually cut angles and utilize those angles to crash the pocket and land big strikes on his opponents. He has good power in his shots, so he could potentially put opponents away as well, just as I spoke about earlier with most of his wins coming by finish, and his defensive grappling, very high level now, very hard for his opponents to take him to the ground, and even harder for them to hold him on the ground if they are able to get him there. And his offensive grappling, when he does find opportunities to take a dominant position, he's very good in terms of controlling those spots and laying down big damage from that top position to eventually get finishes as well. Training, I believe, I think Uzbekistan is where he's from. A lot of his fights recently has come under Mahmoud Muradov's promotion, and he's been doing very well, finishing opponents left and right. He's a very fun addition to the UFC flyweight division, considering the type of style that he brings and his movement and his power and his striking. And I just think he's a much better version of CJ Vergara. Now, in recent fights, sure, Vergara might have a tougher strength of schedule, but when it comes, down to it, I just think that Temirov presents way more issues than Vergara will. Vergara might be able to land a few shots here and there, but I think for the most part, we're going to see Temirov do a good job in terms of utilizing his movement, moving laterally, cutting angles, and utilizing his speed and explosiveness to land the bigger shots on Vergara, and that should, in my opinion, lead to a knockout victory for him. Vergara is tough, he's durable at times, but I don't know if he's faced somebody that can put the type of striking pressure that we'll see Temirov put on him, and if he can handle the big shots that are going to be coming his way. We can't forget, Lacerda nearly finished Vergara as well until he gassed out and Vergara was able to switch the tables there or turn the tables. But I still think that Temirov, if he smells blood, he'll chase it, and I think he'll eventually get the finish here. So give me Temirov and Temirov by knockout. All right, next up, fun striking battle here as we have Chidi Njokuani coming in at minus 160, going up against Jared Gooden, who comes in at plus 140. Now, we'll start off on the Njokuani side, who was able to buck the 3-fight losing streak he was on by getting I thought it was a pretty dominant decision victory over Reese McKee in terms of the damage he was able to lay out. Now, McKee was able to get some control time up against the cage, but he was unable to do much work there, as Njokuani did a great job in terms of getting off on knees and elbows in that close range range, which ultimately allowed two judges to score that fight in his favor. Normally, at his best, he does a great job in terms of utilizing his distance striking to touch opponents up. Great kicks, great knees and elbows inside the clinch when he wants to mix it up there as well. And his defensive grappling has definitely improved a lot since earlier in his career. He's 35 years old, so he's definitely on the tail end of his career, but still very capable of going out there and having very good performances and high-level performances. His 3-fight losing streak, again, knockout loss to Gregory Rodriguez in a fight that he was pretty much controlling for the first half of it until slowing down. Albert Duraev, very, very close fight, but Duraev's grappling ended up paying off that night. And then Duraev actually landed some good strikes in the striking realm as well. And then the Oleg Shajak fight, Njokuani had some good success early, but Oleg Shajak was able to turn the gas up, and Njokuani ended up drowning in that pace and pressure that he was applying. Now, going up against Jared Gooden, who managed to have a comeback victory of his own last time around against Wellington Turman, a fight that he was nearly about to lose in the first round. He turned the tables in the second round, clipped Turman very badly, and then followed that up with the club and sub to get the tap there. Personally, I'm not a big fan of Gooden. He has knockout power, but that's really about it. He has some decent experience under his belt now, coming into his 33rd professional MMA fight. But something that rubs me the wrong way for him about him is the fight that he took against Carlston Harris, which was his return to the UFC after initially getting cut. Now, there's a fight that he did take on short notice, but he missed weight by 7 pounds. That is absolutely inexcusable and horrible for fighters that are looking to make their way into the UFC, trying to take fights on short notice. And he robbed them of that opportunity, knowing that he wasn't going to get anywhere close to the weight. I don't care what weight you accept the fight at, know how much time you have to make that weight, or at least just say from jump, hey, I would rather have this at 175-pound catch weight or 180-pound catch weight because I'm not going to be able to make 170. And, he went on, ended up losing that fight anyway. But I know the UFC matchmakers were definitely not a fan of him coming so heavy into that matchup. Again, he changed his fortune last time around with that win over Turman, but I think a lot of his victories are pertinent on him getting that early finish or finding the knockout at a certain point. He's fighting a technically superior striker here in Njokuani, who should do a good enough job with his clinch work, with his movement, and with his output to keep Jared Gooden at bay. Gooden will obviously be live to land a knockout, obviously, because of the power and explosivity that he brings to the table. So that does give me a little bit of pause here, but I still think that Njokuani can put together a clean enough fight to avoid that big power of Gooden, find the patterns and tendencies of Gooden, avoid those big shots, and eventually just get to his game, mix it up in the clinch, land some big shots there, and end up winning this fight on the scorecards by landing more damage over the course of 15 minutes. All right, next up, middleweights going at it here as we have Abdul Razak Alhassan coming in at -150, going up against Josh Fremd, who comes in at +130. Now, starting off on the Abdul Razak Alhassan side, he's coming off of an unfortunate fight against Cody Brundage where he dropped him and nearly finished him 37 seconds into the fight, but he landed a few shots to the back of the head that rendered Brundage unable to continue. And instead of taking a loss the way Jacob Malkoun did against Cody Brundage for a similar situation, the referee ended up calling it a no contest. And I'm sure Alhassan was very upset considering he was close to getting his win bonus as well that night. Now he takes on a teammate of Josh Fremd. And I'm sure Alhassan has a ton of pent-up aggression that he wants to let go on Fremd, and we might see a very violent version of Alhassan, which normally leads to him getting his wins. His past couple of fights, he did actually have up there in Colorado, training alongside Elevation Fight Team, but it seems like he's moved back down to Fort Worth, Texas, where he has training with a smaller gym, and maybe that's a sign of him just going back to his usual style of going out there and looking to take opponents' heads off. That's where he usually finds most of his success. Training with Team Elevation, they seem to try to implement a little bit more of a clinch heavy approach, a little bit more of a grapple heavy approach, and it just seems like he doesn't have the gas tank to utilize that style effectively over the course of 15 minutes, which causes him to slow down in the second and third rounds, and for opponents to wear on him and either finish him by submission or KO like Joe Pyfer did, or end up winning on the scorecards like Joaquin Buckley did. So I think if Alhassan just focuses on his early explosions, early knockout power, and speed, that would probably be most fruitful for him and allow him to hold on to a UFC roster spot for longer rather than trying to transform his game, especially at 39 years old. It's going to be tough to make a case that he'll end up getting into the rankings or even fighting for a title at any point in his career. His opponent this weekend, Josh Fremd, is looking to avoid a 3-fight losing streak, as last time around he came up short against Andre Petrosky, who was able to land one takedown in each round and control him for 14 minutes, I believe, out of the 15 minutes. Josh Fremd had no answer for the takedowns of Petrosky and was unable to work back to his feet at all. It's funny because that's the approach that Fremd normally takes in his matchups. He utilizes high pace, high pressure, and high activity in terms of grappling to try to wear his opponents down and then eventually find submissions or TKO opportunities later on in matchups. But he's been unable to showcase that style outside of fights against Jamie Pickett and Cedric Dumas, and his durability seems to be a bit of a question mark as well. I had higher expectations for him coming into the UFC, considering what I saw from the regional scene, but again, hasn't really showcased against this level of competition. I expect that we'll see a classic Alhassan performance here as he crashes the pocket early, finds the chin of Josh Fremd, and eventually puts him away. I feel a little bit queasy in terms of taking chalk on him. Minus 150 is not a horrible line. I would rather hone in on that round 1 KO prop, which will probably be slightly plus money. That's the much better line in my opinion, as I think that's probably his best win condition, because if this fight does end up going into the second and third rounds, those big explosions could potentially work against him, and Fremd might be able to start controlling the pace, dictating the pace, and win those next 2 rounds. So Alhassan, round 1 KO, probably the best way to go about it, and that will be my official prediction as well. All right. Moving on to the welterweights now, we got Daniel D-Rod Rodriguez coming in at minus 200, going up against Alex Morono, who comes in at plus 170. Now, Rodriguez is looking to avoid a 4-fight losing streak as he came up short against Kelvin Gastelum back in June. That was a matchup where it was originally scheduled for welterweight, but a horrible weight cut from Kelvin Gastelum forced that matchup to be pushed up to 185 pounds, and I think that kind of worked against Rodriguez and, how he was dieting and trying to cut the weight, and I'm sure he had to put weight back on to even make it to the scale to allow that fight to go on. But he had some decent success in terms of getting to the game that he normally does, trading in the pocket, throwing good combinations, but his power did not have as much success as Gastelum's power, as it was clear that Gastelum was landing with a little bit more emphasis and a little bit more significance and mixing in a little bit of grappling, although he didn't do the most work from that top position as Rodriguez was able to get back to his feet. It was clear that Gastelum was just landing more damage and more pleasing shots for the judges to actually score that fight in his favor. Rodriguez is best when he can trade in the pocket, get to his groove and his combinations, and really touch his opponents up with combinations and high output. And I think from there, that's where he usually gains the confidence to stick to that style, utilize good footwork, keep his range, and keep his opponents at bay. Coming up short against high output guys like Neil Magny, better strikers like Ian Machado Gary, we can give him passes for that. But when he's going up against other guys who are willing to exchange in the pocket with him, that's where he usually ends up coming out on top. And he has a willing dance partner this weekend in Alex Morono. Now, Morono is a BJJ black belt who earlier in his career did not lean on that side of his game because he was just so happy to throw in the pocket, and he did manage to come through with a couple knockout victories. We are seeing him lean on it a little bit more at this stage of his career, but his wrestling is not all that great, which lets him, which eventually causes him to give up on takedowns and then get back to his striking style. He uses a lot of movement, but he has a wide striking stance, which leaves him open to get hurt down the pipe, just as we saw in his last matchup against Nico Price. Now, I'm expecting the majority of this fight to take place in the striking realm, and I have to give Rodriguez the advantage in terms of being a little bit more technical and a little bit more disciplined. And I don't know if Morono no longer has the type of power that will cause Rodriguez issues, and I think Rodriguez also will have the gas tank advantage here, which will allow him to be more successful for a longer period of time. Look for these guys to have a lot of exchanges inside the pocket, but I believe it's going to be Rodriguez who ends up landing the more significant strikes here, which should end up getting him the decision victory. I'm not overly confident in terms of taking him at minus 200. Should the line start coming down a bit closer to that minus 170 range, minus 150 range, hopefully that's where I'll feel comfortable taking a shot on him. But it wouldn't surprise me at all to see Morono and his activity level and his volume possibly be the difference maker as well. And again, we can't overlook the fact that Rodriguez is also a few months shy of his 38th birthday. So I'm still going to go Rodriguez by decision, but I would be a little bit weary in terms of taking that type of chalk on him. All right, next up, Julia Polastri coming in at minus 125 into the strawweight matchup against Corey McKenna, who comes in at plus 105. Now, Polastri had a very close fight last time around against Josephine Knudsen, where she came in as a pretty big underdog, if I'm not mistaken, and she had some moments of success in that fight. Some grappling success, some striking success, but ultimately it was Knudsen who was able to land the more damaging blows, according to the judges, which ultimately got her to the victory that night. Going into that matchup, Polastri had earned her UFC contract on the Contender Series by getting a second round submission victory over her opponent, showcasing great work all around. Normally, she is best when she can utilize a striking heavy approach where she's able to put combinations together, utilize good footwork, and land good damage. But she also has some solid grappling as well, which she utilizes if her opponents clearly have an issue in that aspect of the MMA game. Defensively speaking, she, has shown some flaws in her game where opponents have been able to get the better of her in those spots, but she is showing improvements where she's able to get some reversals, get fights back to the feet, and just showing a little bit more of a awareness in those realms rather than just being a complete fish off of her back. Her first Contender Series shot was against Jasmine Jazz Dovicius at 125 pounds, I believe, back in 2021, and I think that we saw her realize that that's not the weight class for her. Hence why we've seen her down at strawweight ever since. Now going up against Corey McKenna, who's coming off of a submission loss to Jacqueline Amorim earlier this year, which probably one of the worst fight IQ fights I've ever seen, where McKenna willingly went to the ground with Amorim and eventually paid for it by getting submitted by armbar just, I believe, 90 seconds into that matchup. But McKenna usually has good groundwork, good top control, some good pressure from that top position. Her striking is improving, although she doesn't throw with a lot of power. So a lot of opponents, if they're better strikers, can definitely get the better of her, landing more significant blows. But she's been with Team Alpha Male for years now, and it's clear that she is slowly getting better. It would just be nice to see her have some better decision-making inside the cage, especially after what we saw last time around against Jacqueline Amorim. She was also coming off of a 15-month layoff leading into that matchup against Amorim, so we might be able to give her a pass in that aspect. She's still only 25 years old. She could still be making improvements, but in this matchup, I do think that Polastri is the better striker, and that could end up being the difference maker in this matchup. I do expect McKenna will likely look to get to her grappling, where she should be able to get some decent control time against Polastri. But if we are going to believe in the grappling improvements that we've been seeing from Polastri, I think we'll see her either get some submissions off her back, or at least submission attempts, some reversals, some get-ups, and then from there get back to her striking approach, which should allow her to land more damage, make it look better for the judges, and then end up getting her hand raised on the scorecards. Close fight. I understand why the odds are the way they are, and it seems like the line is slowly coming in. Probably might even get to a pick'em spot by the end of the week, but I do like Polastri here, as I do think she's just a little bit more bent on getting damage, and that should nullify the control that McKenna ends up getting in the grappling realm. So give me Polastri by decision, but very close fight for sure. All right, next up, we got Grant Dawson in a lightweight matchup coming in at minus 400, going up against Rafa Garcia coming in at plus 300. Now, Dawson was able to wipe the bad taste of the Bobby Green loss out of his mouth last time around, as he got to his grappling game immediately against Joe Solecki and grinded that fight out with relative ease. Now, he did find himself in a close submission attempt in that first round, but was able to work out of it, just showcasing how disciplined and how good he is in the grappling realm, and how much he trusts his ability to scramble and his defensive ability to not get caught in submissions and be forced to tap or be put to sleep. He's very good with scrambles, and he's very good with chaining his wrestling attempts together, which is why he often lands takedowns and controls his opponents from top position. It's very difficult for opponents to deal with his style because he has great cardio and he has a great ability to just keep a pace and pressure that not a lot of opponents are able to keep up with. His striking game is a lot more flashy than it is substance, but it's all to eventually set up his takedowns, which he finds from any point in the cage. And then if he fails on the first attempt, he changes it to another one, and he always finds his way to get to the mat. And then from there, he's very hard and tough to deal with, considering how heavy he is from that top position and how good his cardio is in terms of continuing to keep that pressure and keep his opponents on his back or on their back. At 30 years old, he's breaking into his prime. I think the UFC is kind of slow rolling him because of, his fights are probably not the most entertaining, but he is dominant. He's tough to deal with. He's going to be very strong. And, if he continues this type of experience, I would love to see how his wrestling fares against somebody like Islam Makhachev and how they would go scramble for scramble and who would end up coming out on top. His opponent this weekend, Rafa Garcia, 2-fight winning streak now, but has been out of the cage for a while. I believe a year and a half at this point in time. But last time around, we saw him just batter Clay Guida over 15 minutes and win that fight on the scorecards. Garcia is a jack of all trades type of fighter. He can strike when he needs to, which I think is the strongest trait in his game. He can grapple when he needs to as well. And there's a great group of guys around him, mentoring him and training alongside him. Guys like Dan Argueta, Cub Swanson, Juan Archuleta, very good, close, tight-knit group, and it's clear that you're seeing the improvements in Garcia's game, who is also 30 years old. But he, in my opinion, he just doesn't have what it takes to get to that next level. And I think, the losses to Drakkar Klose and Nasrat Haqparast are perfect examples of that. Sure, he can be improving and he might be better than he was in those fights. But, going up against upper echelon fighters, I think we'll see him end up coming up short. And I think that's going to happen to him once again here against Dawson. Now, he might have the slight striking advantage from a technical perspective, but it's going to be hard for him to implement that style because of the grappling that he's going to be facing from Dawson. Now, he'll have some good resistance through the first 6 to 7 minutes of this fight, maybe even less than that, but I think eventually he's going to have to succumb to the pace and pressure that Dawson puts on him in the grappling realm, and that will ultimately lead to him losing a decision here. Dawson, he is always going to leave that little bit of concern because of the bad striking defense he has. But if he can just find ways to create chaos in the striking realm for a little bit to eventually change levels and get that wrestling going, that's where he always ends up finding his takedowns, his chain wrestling, and then getting the control that he needs. I think he'll be able to do that to Garcia here. I think he'll be able to wear Garcia out and then really start taking over this fight in the second and third rounds. First round could be a little bit of a pain, but I do expect Dawson to come through and get to a classic Dawson decision victory. Parlayable, definitely a -400 in my opinion, but I think he wins this fight with relative ease. All right. Co-main event time now in the middleweight division, a rebooking of sorts, as we have Brad Tavares coming in at +155, going up against the Iron Turtle, Junyoung Park, who comes in at -180. Now, these guys were originally scheduled to fight a couple months back, but an illness knocked Park out of the fight, hence why they are rebooking it for this week. And now Tavares is now 1-3 over his last 4 fights, being finished in 2 of them by Bruno Silva and then by Gregory Rodriguez. It seems like his durability is taking a little bit of a hit, something that he used to pride himself on in the past. He is also 36 years old and he has a wealth of experience coming into his 30th professional fight, and he's been facing some of the top middleweights throughout his 10 plus years with the promotion. I think at his best, he's a good combination striker, utilizing good leg kicks and good boxing combinations to hurt his opponents, and he can mix it up in the clinch realm when he needs to slow things down and get back or at least try to take command of the pace of the fight once again. I don't think he has title aspirations at this stage of his career. I think he just wants to stay active, collect a few more paychecks, but he will still be a tough out for a lot of opponents, especially considering the stylistic clash that he has ahead of him. Now, he has an interesting one this weekend against Junyoung Park, who's actually coming off of a split decision loss against Andre Muniz last time around in a fight that a lot of people thought he deserved to win. That stopped a 4-fight losing or winning streak, I believe he had going into that matchup, and he was showcasing a lot of dominance in those fights, finishing guys like Joseph Holmes, Dennis Tululian, and Albert Duraev. I do think, those first 2 kind of lower level guys that he was able to end up getting the victory over. Even the Eric Anders decision win, sketchy decision, but he did end up getting his hand raised. I think Park is best when he can get to his grappling and take opponents to the ground and utilize his jiu-jitsu. He has a very slick submission game as well, but I think he's going to struggle to get to that here against Tavares, who should do a good enough job in terms of keeping this fight upright and then landing the better strikes on the feet. Park has a little bit of power that could cause some issues for Tavares, but I think we'll see a little bit more of a disciplined and technical approach from Tavares, and I think that he'll be able to slow down Park the later that this fight goes, which should allow Tavares to start cruising with his combination striking and eventually getting to a decision victory. Again, it's hard to completely trust Tavares considering the run that he's been on as of late and the potential of his decline considering all the miles and fights that he's already been through. But stylistically speaking, if he can shut down the grappling of Park here, he should have a lot of success in the striking realm, taking advantage of some of the striking flaws in Park's game, landing the better shots, and end up winning this fight on the scorecards. I'm going to consider taking a shot on this later on in the week, seeing where this line ends up going. But I do think that Tavares and his experience will definitely show off in this matchup, and we'll see him end up getting his hand raised, once again, like I said, by decision. All right. Main event time now. Flyweights going at it here as we have Brandon Royval coming in at plus 190, going up against Tatsuro Taira, who comes in at minus 225. Now, starting off with Brandon Royval, who was able to pull off a victory and avenge his loss to Brandon Morono earlier this year. Was a close fight. I think it was a split decision victory for Royval, but he showcased very solid boxing and good range management, where he was able to piece up Brandon Morono from distance in the last 3 rounds of their 5-round fight. I thought we would see Morono a little bit more urgent in terms of getting this fight to the ground. I think we saw Royval stop 2 of the 5 takedown attempts that were shot against him, but he did a great job in terms of shutting down the control from Morono, getting back to his feet, and then getting back to his distance boxing style that he was looking to employ in that night. And it was a lot of activity and just long-range weapons that he was utilizing to thwart the style that Morono was bringing to the table. I was surprised that Morono just continued to go to the same combination over and over again, capitalized by that leaping or that winging overhand, which landed a few times against Royval, but Royval was able to nullify that quickly by landing a few straight shots down the pipe, utilizing his speed and his range to land the more slicker shots. I was very impressed to see that disciplined approach from Royval, considering he is normally a very chaotic fighter that likes to just move forward, throw elbows, throw knees, throw flying stuff, and look to really hurt his opponents from distance. But he also has a very aggressive BJJ game, which he has looked to utilize recently, more so to get back to his feet rather than actually looking to lock up submissions or give up bad positions for his opponents to get the better of him. 32 years old, coming into his prime, maturing, obviously, just as we saw in his last matchup. But I think it all depends on the type of matchup he has ahead of him. Now, he's going up against 24-year-old Tatsuro Taira, who has an impeccable, flawless 16-0 record and picked up the biggest win of his career last time around by defeating Alex Perez. Now, he actually lost the first round of that matchup, with Perez utilizing a lot of movement, a lot of combinations, crashing the pocket, and shutting down the takedown game of Taira. And then in the second round, Taira was able to get his back, jumping on his back, and then eventually utilized a weird position where he had this weird leverage point where he grapevined the leg of Perez and pulled him to the ground. And during that motion, it seemed like Perez blew out his knee, ultimately leading to a TKO victory for Tatsuro Taira. I don't believe entirely in his wrestling game, but he does find ways to get involved in the grappling realm, which is ultimately where he ends up getting the better of his opponents. His striking is slowly coming along, although a lot of it seemed to be just soft kicks that he eventually sets up his takedowns behind. But seeing the type of confidence that he had in the Carlos Hernandez fight, throwing fast, straight, powerful shots down the pipe and knocking him out like that, maybe he's growing in confidence and throwing with his hands a little bit more as well. I would like to see that confidence in this fight against Royval, because I think Royval leaves a lot of openings to be hit, especially with how active he is and the lack of head movement that we normally see from him. And that could ultimately lead to better opportunities for Taira to change levels and get this fight to the ground. I do not believe wholeheartedly in Royval's takedown defense still, but again, his ability to create scrambles and reversals allow him to get back to his feet, just as we saw in the Morono fight. But I think it's going to get harder for him to get those positions, to get out of those spots against a guy like Taira, who has very good control once he is finally able to establish a position. That's why I lean Taira here. I think he can initiate those grappling sequences that's going to cause Royval a lot of issues in terms of getting out of those spots. Now, I'm not totally confident to the point of being willing to take that minus 225 on Taira. If Royval is able to shut down the grappling and stick with his striking and really put that volume and pace on Taira, he could definitely get the better of him in that aspect. And I am kind of leaning the over 3.5 at even money more than anything in this fight. I think we'll see a lot of grappling. I think we'll see a lot of good defensive work from Royval. And then I think we'll see also a lot of striking, which may not lead to a finish considering the lack of knockout power from either guy. Obviously, they have knockouts in recent fights, but I don't think that, considering how this fight should play out, I don't think it'll translate into this matchup. But I think a lot of it's going to be Taira looking to get the grappling going, and we'll get a lot of dead time, which should eat some minutes off the clock and hopefully get over that 12.5 minute mark. I guess it's 17.5 minutes. 5, 10, 15, Yeah, 17 and a half minutes. Doing some quick math off the top of my head. Over 3.5 is what I'm talking about. But official prediction will be Taira. Taira by decision, with him just getting enough control time here and getting his hand raised on the scorecards. Very close fight. Should tell us a lot about both guys and where they're at in their career. But I'm not going to bet this fight other than considering the 3.5, over 3.5. All right. There you guys go. Full predictions for UFC Vegas 98. Appreciate all the love. Appreciate all the support. Tomorrow I'll be dropping the top 3 lock of the night plays, top 3 dog of the night plays, or I should say candidates. They are not always plays. They are just candidates. And then hopefully we have a successful Contender series tonight as well for the penultimate event that they have before they finish up the season next season. So again, appreciate the love, appreciate the support. Drop a comment, drop a like, drop a subscribe if you haven't already as well. I'm so damn close to 8,000 subscribers, hoping to crack that mark before the end of the Contender series season. So it would be greatly appreciated if you guys helped your boy out there. All right, good luck on all your action, folks, and I'll see you guys again tomorrow for the top 3 lock of the night candidates and top 3 dog of the night candidates. Peace.
Last thing.